whether we agree with it or not, whether we agree with the complete embellishment of Mandela as opposed to the mass movement, that's the question. But for the Palestinians, ever since the destruction of the Oslo Accords and the diminishing of the PLO, now the question is not only in Palestine who speaks for Palestine, but also those of us outside Palestine. So you, for example, I can say that I can speak for Palestine, and Chomsky can say that he speaks for Palestine. And we disagree. Or the BDS movement as to whether they speak with a particular focus, and then that gets reflected in the movement outside that begins to articulate what is correct and what is not correct, and what is emphasis, so you can have groups that'll say, and I really hate this term, and I am for nonviolence, but I hate when it's used in a way to diminish all of the other forms of struggle that the Palestinians have had to use at different phases, and I'm specifically talking about armed struggle that had to be used at a particular moment. Whether it was successful, correct, and there were aspects of it that we definitely would question anyone who is thinking, but I think the problem of leadership, central leadership, and getting back, and that connects to what Ryan said earlier about 68. 68 was a very critical moment in history where a whole generation of young students who began to question their societies, and then in the process of the struggle took on different theoretical frameworks, by and large, of course, a very big development of Marxism with all its various connotations and various manifestations, but there was a moment of theoretical motion that began to raise an answer to the critical social political reality. Today, as an old guy, I have a hard time because I don't see that happening, and actually I see a regression. I see, what's his name? Ahmed made a very critical point. More and more today, the generation of activists don't, because of a number of reasons, don't look to organization. They don't look to leadership. They are promoting a very, in my view, a distorted concept of anarchism, you know, and I see that with the young generation, and I could be wrong, but I see it, at least I don't think I'm wrong. Actually, I don't think I'm wrong, because I do engage a lot of the young new generation activists. A lot of the new formations of young people who are struggling to come up with a perspective in the absence and in the bankruptcy, of course, of the PA, but also in the absence of the left in Palestine. The lack of the left providing leadership, all right, and also, so there you have a new groupings of formations who are grappling, but more within this framework of a distorted concept of anarchism and lack of hierarchy and theoretical framework, and then a mishmash of theory. So that's why I think what we're trying to project is important, but it does pose a problem for us, because how do we do that? How do we navigate this project with the difficulties of the political leadership?
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to them. There were many, many interesting points made. So,
I'm gonna pass. I mean, I think a lot's been said. It's been a long day, and so I know that we're not going to be able to cover all the questions that are on the floor, but I think we got a good start on the next steps, and I'm hoping that some of the discussions will continue. I think there is some questions about how those discussions are going to continue within the current network that's already established. We'll probably go back to how Rabab wants to take this on, and prioritizing all the things that we've discussed. I think that would be very important, and I'd be excited about a whole wide range of things. So thanks again for everything.
Can I ask if everybody in the room has signed the paper that went around? Okay.
And do you have it back, Enrico? It's already, it's with
So
Diego.
presumably there can be communication with all these people, and people can give ideas continually. Okay, Saad, did you?
Yeah, I'm glad that Maha, it's really amazing that sometimes we meet outside of Palestine, because sometimes it's harder to meet in Palestine, but we'd like to, network and continue, inshallah. I'm just having this issue, wrote something, teaching people who teach Palestine.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Teaching people who teach Palestine. I'm talking about everybody. Actually, I'm learning here. It's a learning process for me too. I'm not like a guru, about teaching Palestine. And we need to humble ourselves and like I don't use the neoliberal the teaching of trainer, TOT or something like that. No, train the trainer. No, but let's say teach people who teach Palestine, and this is what we're doing, I think. So maybe that term. I like what Victoria mentioned, that not only like the vocational, we have a wide range of things in Palestine in terms of academia, and it's also the community colleges that can help on the board in terms of that. Okay. I want to address also the issue about BRICA. BRICA, because you use the acronym, it's British Universities for Palestine, and it's called British Committee for Universities of Palestine. Actually, we did host. I organized a delegation for them. You could see all of them here in Al-Najah, and there are kinds of groups like this around the world who are trying to address Palestinian right to education and support, and that's institutionalized. If Ahmed likes this institution, this is institutionalized, and they have their magazine, and you're active with them. And it's very good to network with them because they're a group of academics. They're all academics and activists, academic activists. So that's very, very lucid. Actually, I wrote this before you mentioned it, and I wanted to bring it up. I'm glad you brought it up. Again, Diego, thank you. I was so happy to see you again, and all these obstacles for people to come in, and also they try to steer people away from Palestine, either through funding, and it's deliberate, actually. Some of the stuff is deliberate through Euro-Mediterranean stuff. Sometimes they want to force you to, if you want to get funding, you have to make it trilateral with Israeli and European. It's disgusting sometimes. And that's why we want to look at the bilateral. We need to increase the bilateral. We need to get them away from the picture. They want also to involve the Israelis. Otherwise, the project does not get funding. Okay. The last thing I want to address, which is very important, because we actually do the Jaime point. We, post-Oslo, we do have a crisis of leadership. And actually, it's affecting everything. This crisis of leadership and our model, the Palestinian Authority went into this model, or this formula, and this formula, it looks like unending. I mean, you go into this formula, it's to maintain the status quo, and the status quo is not ending. As Abu Mazen once said, I don't like the word status quo. He won one of the conferences. And okay, we need to change the status quo, but with this formula, it will propagate. And this is actually creating a crisis of identity. Not only identity for young people. We grew up in a national movement that had a unified representation. We looked for the PLO. The Fida'i, the armed struggle, was the model. Now the Fida'i is gone. Now they want to, in our psyche, in the young people's psyche, they want to replace it with what we call it popular, non-violent, smooth, kissing, non-violent resistance. No, I'm not belittling popular. I'm not belittling popularism, but as my Habibi from South Africa, Naim, he said we should not claim fictitious victories. Small thing, oh, Al-Khan al-Ahmar is becoming like we're debating Palestine. You know, small stuff, the conference, it's like claiming victories when it's not, I'm not against popular struggle or non-violent struggle. I'm not saying that. I believe that there should be, to look at reality. The reality of the situation needs to be addressed in terms. About the one-state, two-state solution, and Bob had mentioned it. Look, I think when we talk about Palestine, Rabab says maybe we should not talk about the one-state solution. She said maybe we can talk about effecting justice and self-determination. I've been struggling to talk with the BDS movement to actually articulate the goal. Articulate the goal. Say we want to end Zionism, we want to end apartheid, and replace it with something. That includes self-determination. I once wrote a 9 program, how to bring about the one-state solution, and I put it in the media. I should translate it because that's will bring people. Look, we're bringing people on a unified goal. We don't have a unified goal. The Hamas people are saying something and they're changing it. The Palestinian Authority is sticking only to this mantra of two-state solution that is non-existent. So we are in a predicament. If we don't come out and really enunciate our goal, a Palestinian national movement saying our goal is to end apartheid and replace it with a secular democratic state, we can talk about the nature of a secular democratic state, but we have to spell it out. People are lost. People are lost. This is my opinion. This is my opinion as somebody who spent all his life struggling and paid a heavy price for that. And I want to stop here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see if Naeem has some possible
I'm sensitive to Jaime's question about who speaks for Palestinians.
Yeah.
As a non-Palestinian, I'll maintain my silence. I'll pass.
Okay, so I actually want to, teaching people who teach Palestine, I think this is one of the goals. And actually, some of us who are involved with other forums, we've actually been involved in it, kind of like training people to be able to do that. When I say training people to be able to teach, it doesn't mean that everybody has one knowledge and the others don't, but to actually have to do it together. And you remember the institutes that we did with Al-Quds University back in 2005 and 2006, and now we actually have an institute at the National Women's Studies Association called Teaching Gender and Sexual Justice in Arab and Muslim Communities. So it's only half day, it's not enough, it's, we'll take whatever we can, okay? And that takes me to very quickly, I'm just responding very quickly, the whole question about teaching Islam and so on. There is 2 issues about that. One, basically, it's whether people are qualified or not, whether they have the expertise. Post 9/11, 2001, everybody started studying Islam and Muslims. Everybody. And there were millions and millions and millions of dollars in it. And that is why actually our name is called Muslim Communities, not Islam. Even though the university wanted to do with Islam in order to make money, and I said, well, you want to do Islam? Then you need to hire maybe 12 scholars or something who know Islamic scripture, who can do it, and forget about the whole, funding and so on. But this has been going on. But that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it has to do with the problematic, inherent problem of producing colonial, orientalist, Zionist knowledge about people in these areas of the world. Okay, however you want to call them. So people get away with everything. People can do very shoddy scholarship or no scholarship whatsoever, and they can pretend they know what they're going, and then it's okay. And the problem is that, and especially, and I will use Palestine, when you actually hold people accountable, one of the biggest battles that we are dealing with is this whole accusations of anti-Semitism and terrorism by Zionist groups in order to really distract and take away from 2 things. One is that there is more people interested in the academy, and B, there are more people specifically in European and US societies that are more supportive of Palestine and joining the rest of the world. They're joining the rest of humanity because the world generally supports justice for in Palestine. It is the oddity of the exclusions, and even the way governmental things work and so on. So they are really troubled by it. And in 2010, the Reut Institute in Israel came out with a report and recommendations of how to confront people who are doing this. It took a few years. After Gaza, there was a complete panic in the Israeli institutions in order to see how can they confront. And this is one of the ways, and it looks like a playbook. There is a memo somebody wrote that is being sent to everybody, and it's being enacted. And when people compare experiences, it happens everywhere. Sometimes it's about discriminating against students. Sometimes it's about scholarships. Sometimes it's about academic programs. Sometimes you get the right-wing big donors to come in and give money in order to buy other programs. It's one thing or another. Sometimes it's the bureaucracy within the institution because they scare and they intimidate people to change. And everywhere, and sometimes it's about not saying Palestine. I mean, this is why actually we were trying to say, count how many courses are called Palestine. Not Palestinian Israeli, not Arab Israeli, not the Middle East, not conflict, Palestine. We wanted to see how many courses are called Palestine, who's teaching them, what's going on. And this is part of the research that we are doing. And it's part of erasing and invisibilizing a struggle of a people by these. And so one of the major, I think, agendas for us to actually be able to continue questioning that the Zionists do not own Jewishness. They do not. I'm sorry. The Zionists do not own Jewishness. The Israeli government does it. Netanyahu does it. There is a history. There is a very complex history of Jewishness that is too complex to sit down and say in one sentence. It requires a lot of discussion. We started talking a little bit about 1492 and talked about the Inquisition because there is the facade in Hukmas that everything was so wonderful. There's always been with the Rios Catholicus, everything was wonderful and tolerance and so on. And we're living on the rubbles of the Inquisition and the expansion of the Arabs and Muslims. Anyway, okay, I will stop in that soapbox. So I think there is an issue about that. And Palestine provides a very good, useful cover for colonialist, orientalist, Zionist discourses in order to cover up a lot of the stuff and get away with it. And you can see it in the way in which, quote unquote, Middle East gets framed. So it is not just, it's not innocent, it is not accidental, it's not isolated, it's systemic, and it is a way of understanding things. And it's also the whole question of people not holding themselves accountable, the scholars who are studying quote-unquote Middle East, or they talk about, oh, the tribes that they are studying, and these savage people, or this nostalgic way of life, and it's all these things that they inscribe on people. That's not really what the people are all about. And it's very shoddy, it's very disrespectful, it's non-accountable, and so on. So that becomes part of it. And then, the next thing is what Jaime is talking about. Who speaks for the Palestinians? And Victoria raised the question too, is that then those of us in the Western Academy are not considered authentic Palestinians because we don't come with, I'm not Sa'id. Kind of like every single time, and I'm not saying that, I'm not undermining it, but there is a question about those of us who are actually interacting with these things day in and day out. Let's say in the Israeli Academy, Palestinian scholars are always continuously, we've heard many times from Palestinian women scholars that they want to study about the environment, and their professor said to them, why don't you go study violence? Why don't you study violence against women in your society or something? It's a very colonialist, orientalist, feminist discourse. And so there is all of these things continue being produced again and again and again, and we are being confronted with them. So this is a question about questions of authenticity. Who raises this? So that's one question. The question of decolonizing methodologies and the research that you mentioned, Enrico, I don't think that discussion is ever going to be resolved. I don't think we will ever be able to resolve the whole tension between the relationship of the scholar to the community, unless it doesn't completely get resolved. But there are ways to undermine that and to think about. One of them is gatekeeping. I mean, everybody and their cousin can have a passport and go visit Palestine. And Palestinians, because there is a complete isolation, are very happy to receive people and welcome them. And sometimes people go and they want to sleep in people's homes and inconvenience them and so on. Everybody says, hello, welcome. We are so generous. Like, Where you get of being so generous when it's a people colonized? So there is parts of it. Other parts of it is once you produce something, you have no control over it. Once the thing in the public, so then that takes me to the next question: who's your audience? Who is the audience and who's your public? And we're speaking to multiple publics. So I believe that there are conversations to be had in Arabic that I'm not going to have in English. I'm sorry, I refuse. And people say, I do not know, it's fine. I'm very happy to be labeled as ignorant of certain things and not an expert, I do not, because I refuse to have certain conversations unless we have them in different spaces, in different ways and so on. I'm not willing, I don't want to perform in public unless it's actually going to be something that actually advances something I believe in, something I want to research and so on. I'm not going to do that. Okay, I'm sorry. So there is something about that. What do we do with it? Where do we share the information? What kind of methodology we do? Who is involved in it? What kind of accountability? And we have to be open ourselves to the criticism. We cannot say we want to do the research and then say, oh, we don't like the result because, oh, these people are complaining. So they have the right to complain. And I tell my students, and students know that if the person you interview says to you, delete 10 hours, you delete 10 hours. No question about it. You do not hide it and say, I deleted it, and you hide it for a scoop in the future. You delete it. Because there is a question of accountability, and this is a question of actually really mentoring people to be principled researchers, principled scholars. That is when the scholarship is accountable. And by the way, that becomes, at this point, it's only individual desires. That's it, that's all we can do. Okay, we can hope. But when there is a collective movement that gets built, then it is no longer people doing their own individual desires, then it is actually a collective will that imposes itself, and then those people who don't want to be accountable become the odd person out, and they are no longer part of the collective, and we know the history of the research on sexuality, for example, the book, I don't know, go check it out, it's called Tea Room Trade, and we can tell you about it afterwards. One guy who was spying on people who were engaged in sex, in same sex and so on, and it's not a good, at the time it was a school, now it's complete no-no. I mean, that person will be shunned in the academy. Things change. And there is a way for us to push and shift the discourse. And I think teaching Palestine is part of these ways of pushing and being very, very deliberate about it. One more, just one more thing I wanted to say. The Autonomous University and University of Granada and anybody, let's please talk. Let's please have a conversation about, and I have my business card and we can talk about that. I think what we want to do next, I think this would be a time for to do. The last thing is the question of leadership and Oslo. I think that there is a problem, crisis of leadership, but for me, I'm going to speak as a Palestinian and as a scholar. As a Palestinian at this point, I think building grassroots, this is all we can do as scholars. At least those of us who are in different, wherever we are in position, we can build movements, we can educate, we can engage, we can critique, we can do all of these things and see how things develop and grow. I think it's going to take time, as a Palestinian now, I think it's going to take time when we get a different kind of, whatever it is going to be, reforming the PLO, or it's going to create an alternative and engaging and so on, and until that time happens, we are going to see all sorts of the neoliberal Palestine Solidarity Industrial Complex. But we were going to see that. And some of it is great, and some of it is not so great. And that's okay. Because a lot of it is okay. I mean, it pushes the discourse, it's challenging, and I think that's okay with that. So I think this the biggest, the final question, you said Khan al-Ahmar, and Rayan said Ahad Tamimi. And I think both Khan al-Ahmar and Ahad Tamimi became that everybody, some people will say in Palestine, well, there is multiple Ahad Tamimi. Yes, there are multiple Ahad Tamimi. But now Ahad Tamimi is presented. Yeah. She's a young kid who was arrested and imprisoned for defending herself, right? No, I say you didn't. You mentioned Khan al-Tamimi, and I'm building on that. So this is something that actually she gets presented. It is not her fault that she gets thrown into fame. The question is, how do we frame it? How do we analyze it? How do we keep talking about the thousands and thousands of Palestinian women, men and children who are resisting every single day? And make sure that we are giving this young woman her due, because she is resisting. And at the same time also talk about the connectivity of people historically and contemporarily who continue to resist day in and day out. And not to say we pick and choose who are the heroes we want to worship and who are the people who don't. So we only have one Mandela, because that is not the way to build a collective society.
And I did not want to belittle what's happening in the Khan
Yeah,
Ahmad.
but that's exactly what I was saying.
Yeah, and I'm glad you clarified it, because sometimes they iconize it and it exaggerates the actual context of decolonization. You know, and that's because, you know, I respect the people who are doing work there, but not to, you know.
Well, thank you to everybody. Thank you to all the fabulous participants, to Rabab especially. You know, to Salim for all your brilliance and technical work. No, he's been
Yes,
look
yes.
at
And
this.
Enrico,
He's
by
been
the way.
doing and
And Paula
Enrico.
had that.
Hello, he's been,
Yeah.
but he's been recording this
Yeah.
whole
And-
procedure, and we have him to thank because we have access to it online. And these conversations will continue.
This is streaming online, right?
Yes,
Hmm.
yes. So you're responsible for everything.
Well, sometimes I get too passionate. If you see something that is, I don't want to go into censorship. Hello, peace.
Right.
Yes, yes.
But it's
The
not-
symposium is officially ended. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.